The year was 1756, and the sun had barely risen over the rolling hills of Virginia when Sarah Williams first set foot on the grounds of the sprawling estate that would become her prison. The mansion loomed ahead, a vast structure of brick and timber, its white pillars gleaming against the early morning mist. To anyone who glimpsed it from afar, it was the picture of wealth, power, and refinement, a family name etched into the history of the region, respected and feared in equal measure. But for Sarah, it was a world she would soon navigate with the caution of a cat walking along a treacherous ledge, a place where one misstep could cost her life. Sarah was not like the other girls brought to the estate. Even in the eyes of those who had lived in the shadow of slavery all their lives, she seemed unusually observant, unusually quiet, and unusually careful. There was an intelligence in her eyes, dark and penetrating, that suggested she saw far more than she revealed. She understood that silence could be a shield, that the world around her was both her danger and her teacher. On that first morning, as she was led through the gates by the overseer, she memorized every detail, the sharp angles of the windows, the patterns in the paving stones, the precise location of the servants' quarters, the kitchen, and the dining hall where the family would gather each evening in smug opulence. Every detail was a puzzle piece, every corner a potential advantage. The family she was to serve was known in the county for their strict rules and their harsh treatment of those under them. Mr. Harland, the patriarch, was a man whose temper was as legendary as his wealth. His sharp words could cut deeper than any whip, and his eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Harland, his wife, was a woman obsessed with appearances, with maintaining a household that displayed power and superiority at every glance. And their children, taught from birth to mimic their parents' cruelty, carried themselves with a sense of entitlement that bordered on arrogance. They believed the world existed solely to serve them, to feed their whims, and to bolster their pride. Sarah immediately recognized this arrogance as both a weakness and an opportunity. She was introduced to the household in the way all new servants were, carefully, slowly, watched closely. Every gesture, every word was scrutinized. The Harlands had already had their share of servants come and go, some punished severely for the slightest error, others dismissed without notice. Sarah, however, moved through her first day with a deliberate, measured grace. She spoke only when spoken to, but when she did, her words were precise and respectful, never faltering. She studied her masters as if cataloguing every characteristic, every habit. How Mr. Harland poured his tea, how Mrs. Harland arranged her silverware, how the children laughed with a sense of superiority. Nothing escaped her notice. It was not just observation that set her apart, it was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, a sense that though she might bend under the weight of oppression, she would never be broken entirely. Her eyes, dark and steady, missed nothing. She saw the fleeting expressions of anger that crossed Mr. Harland's face when a servant delayed his coat or spilled a drop of wine. She saw the subtle disgust in Mrs. Harland's gaze when the kitchen floors were not polished to perfection. She saw the way the children sneered at those smaller, weaker, or slower than themselves. Every observation was stored away in her mind, catalogued and filed with precision. Even in her first interactions with the other servants, Sarah displayed a remarkable ability to navigate a world of danger and politics. The kitchen was a place of unspoken hierarchy, a battlefield where loyalty and deceit mingled freely. The older women watched her with suspicion, wondering if she would last a week under the harsh regime. The younger ones whispered, sharing rumors of punishments that had befallen those who displeased the family. Sarah listened, nodded, and absorbed it all, but never revealed more than necessary. She learned who could be trusted, who would betray, and who was too afraid to act at all. Her survival depended not on strength, but on knowledge and strategy, and she understood that from the very first day. The work was grueling, yet Sarah approached it with a calm efficiency that both impressed and unsettled those around her. She learned the layout of the estate quickly, memorizing the narrow hallways, the hidden closets, and the servants' passages that ran behind the walls. She knew where Mr. Harland would retire after dinner, where Mrs. Harland kept her jewelry, where the children hid their small treasures. Every corner, every doorway, every locked chest became a piece of the larger picture she was quietly constructing in her mind. She understood that power often lay not in strength, but in knowledge, and she intended to accumulate it with patience. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah continued to blend into the rhythm of the household. To her masters, she seemed nothing more than a competent, obedient servant, unremarkable and easy to overlook. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm was quietly building. She observed every mealtime, every family argument, every moment of arrogance and cruelty, committing each to memory. She noticed that Mr. Harland's temper was worst after dinner, that Mrs. Harland's obsession with cleanliness made her vulnerable to distraction, that the children's arrogance blinded them to even the most obvious dangers. Each observation was a thread in a tapestry of knowledge, a map she could follow when the time came to act. Sarah also understood the subtle art of influence. She learned how to gain small privileges, how to earn trust, and how to manipulate perceptions without raising suspicion. A kind word here, a careful nod there, a seemingly accidental slip of information, all were tools she used to navigate the dangerous terrain of the Harland household. She was careful not to let anyone see her true intelligence, concealing it beneath a veneer of humility and deference. To the family, she was merely a capable servant. To herself, she was a strategist laying the foundation for a plan that no one could anticipate. It was in these quiet, often unnoticed moments that Sarah's true strength became apparent. She learned to move through the house almost invisibly, to hear conversations meant to be private, to witness the cracks in the armor of her oppressors. Every whispered insult, every threat, every boastful claim was a piece of the puzzle. She began to see patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. She recognized that while the Harlands wielded power over their servants, they were not invincible. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their sense of superiority, they were all exploitable if one had the patience and intelligence to act. And yet, Sarah never allowed herself to be consumed by hatred. She understood that to survive and to execute her plan, she needed patience, calm, and careful calculation. She observed without judgment, learned without revealing, and waited without impatience. The household may have underestimated her, but she had studied them in detail, learning the rhythm of their lives, the flaws in their character, and the vulnerabilities hidden behind their wealth and arrogance. She was a quiet storm, gathering strength in silence, preparing for a moment that would come without warning but with devastating effect. As the first month passed, Sarah became a fixture in the household, someone whose presence was necessary but unremarkable. The family continued their routines, oblivious to the eyes that watched them with careful attention. She served their meals, cleaned their rooms, tended to their whims, and yet behind the calm exterior, she was building a mental map of every habit, every weakness, every secret. Each day brought her closer to understanding the family in its entirety, and each observation was a step toward a plan that no one could foresee. By the end of her first season in the Harland household, Sarah Williams had achieved something remarkable. She had become invisible to those who mattered, yet she had seen everything. She had earned a measure of trust without ever revealing her true nature. She had mapped every corner of the estate, every routine of the family, every flaw that would one day become crucial. She was patient, she was calculating, and she was ready to wait for the moment when the knowledge she had gathered could be transformed into action. In a world where one mistake could cost her life, Sarah had learned to thrive in silence. She had discovered that observation was a weapon, that intelligence was armor, and that patience could turn the meekest servant into a force no one would see coming. The Harlands believed that he controlled every aspect of their household, that every servant bent beneath their will, and that they were untouchable. They were wrong. And by the time the sun rose again over the Virginia hills, Sarah Williams was no longer just a servant, she was a quiet strategist, a mind sharp and unyielding, preparing for a night that would change everything. Little did anyone know, the calm, obedient girl who moved silently through the halls, carrying trays and polishing silver, was quietly preparing to become a force of unimaginable consequence. The first section of her story was not yet one of action. It was a story of preparation, of observation, of patience. And in that careful, unremarkable beginning lay the seeds of a night that would forever alter the legacy of one proud, arrogant family. Sarah Williams was patient, she was watchful, and she was ready. One day the world would see the results of the quietest, most observant mind in the Harland household, and when it came, no one would ever forget it. Life within the Harland household was a delicate dance of appearances, discipline, and hidden resentment. By the second month of her servitude, Sarah Williams had begun to see the household for what it truly was, a fortress built on arrogance, cruelty, and blind confidence in its own invincibility. The family believed their wealth and power made them untouchable, that the vast rooms, polished floors, and towering walls could shield them from any harm. They did not see the undercurrent. Rents running beneath every smile, every curt command, every laugh dripping with condescension. Sarah, however, saw it all. Every nuance, every hidden twitch, every whispered insult was a window into their weaknesses. She learned the rhythm of the household, the predictable ebbs and flows of authority, and the blind spots that no one, not even the parents, noticed. The patriarch, Mr. Harland, ruled his household with a volatile temper. His wrath was swift, merciless, and often unpredictable. A servant spilling a drop of wine, a dish not seasoned to his exacting standards, or a servant daring to hesitate in anticipation of his orders could draw his fury in a matter of seconds. Yet there were cracks beneath the rigid exterior. Sarah noticed how his anger was worse after dinner, when the indulgence of food and drink loosened his patience and sharpened his temper. She observed the subtle patterns, when he was most easily irritated, what phrases set him off, how he treated his wife in public versus in private. All of these observations became pieces of a puzzle she quietly assembled in her mind, threads of knowledge she would one day weave into a plan of exacting consequence. Mrs. Harland, in contrast, wielded her power more quietly but no less effectively. She was a woman obsessed with the image of perfection, obsessed with controlling every detail in her home. Silverware had to be polished until it gleamed unnaturally, floors had to shine like mirrors, and every corner had to be free of dust, no matter how slight. She prided herself on the submission and obedience of her servants and was quick to scold any who displeased her. Yet Sarah saw the contradictions in her behavior. The woman was cruel to the powerless yet fearful of her peers, concerned with outward appearances while ignoring the rot beneath. She spent hours fussing over her dresses, her hair, and the household, yet she neglected the subtler dangers that lurked in the shadows, dangers that Sarah quietly catalogued with the precision of a historian. The children, too, were a study in entitlement and arrogance. Raised to mimic the harshness of their father and the vanity of their mother, they carried themselves with a sense of superiority that bordered on arrogance. They taunted the younger, weaker servants and took delight in minor cruelties, believing their family's name and wealth insulated them from consequence. Sarah noted their patterns, their childish temperaments, and their predictable flaws. She learned which child was the most gullible, which was most prone to jealousy, which would overreact at the slightest insult. These details, trivial to the family, were invaluable to Sarah's understanding of the household's internal mechanics. Every smile she offered to the children, every seemingly innocent nod or word of encouragement was carefully calculated to foster trust while hiding her true awareness of their character. In the kitchen and servant quarters, Sarah's observations took on a different texture. Here the power dynamics were subtle, delicate, and often dangerous. The older servants watched her with suspicion, their lives scarred by years of punishment and humiliation. They whispered among themselves, trading tales of those who had angered the Harlands and suffered for it. Sarah listened without judgment, committing the stories to memory. She learned who was loyal, who was fearful, who might betray her if necessary, and who would protect a fellow servant out of simple decency. In these whispered conversations, she began to understand a second layer of the household, the survival instincts of those who knew too well the cost of misstep. Her ability to navigate these relationships without exposing herself was remarkable. She offered assistance when needed, observed quietly when confronted, and learned to turn even minor slip-ups into lessons in patience and strategy. If a fellow servant misstepped, Sarah watched how the Harlans reacted and recorded it in her mind. If a cook burned a meal or a maid arrived late, she observed the consequence, the tone of reprimand, the hidden emotions behind each gesture. These lessons were invisible to the family, but to Sarah they were vital tools, sharpening her understanding of how power worked in the household. Despite the grueling labor, Sarah found moments of reflection that strengthened her resolve. In the quiet of the night, when the family slept and the halls were silent, she would move through the checking the locks, noting the layout, and imagining every scenario. How could a plan be executed without detection? Which weaknesses could be exploited? Where were the blind spots, the overlooked habits, the vulnerabilities masked by arrogance? She was patient, methodical, and meticulous, understanding that impulsive action would be catastrophic. Survival demanded intelligence and patience, and Sarah possessed both in abundance. Over time, small incidents revealed more about the family than words ever could. She observed Mr. Harlan's hidden insecurities beneath his bluster, Mrs. Harlan's fear of social disgrace, even as she wielded cruelty over her servants, and the children's innate sense of entitlement, masking deep ignorance. One evening she witnessed a dispute between the parents over the inheritance of a neighbor's property, the argument conducted in hushed tones behind closed doors. The father's anger and pride clashed with the mother's cunning and need for control, a tension that the children only partially understood, but fully absorbed as an example of what power looked like in their world. Each of these moments added depth to Sarah's understanding of the household she inhabited, and each was a step toward a plan that would one day take advantage of these very tensions. Mealtimes were a particular focus for Sarah. The family gathered in the dining hall, their every action observed by servants who knew their place and feared the consequences of misstep. Here, Sarah paid attention to the smallest details, the order in which dishes were served, the family members' favorite foods, the way they reacted to taste, temperature, and seasoning. She noticed that Mr. Harlan's pride often led him to boast after a drink, that Mrs. Harlan's vanity made her distracted while choosing between similar dishes, and that the children's arrogance often blinded them to subtle changes in flavor or texture. Every observation became a mental blueprint, a map she could follow when the time came to act. Sarah's intelligence extended to emotional manipulation as well. She learned how to mirror emotions to reflect what her masters wanted to see while masking her own intent. A smile here, a nod there, a word of sympathy in the right tone. Each was a tool to gain trust, to appear compliant and submissive while her mind worked silently behind the scenes. She understood that the Harlans judged everyone by their outward behavior, by appearances, and she mastered the art of hiding her true self beneath a veneer of obedience and humility. Despite the constant danger and relentless labor, Sarah began to develop a quiet confidence. She understood the rhythms of her world, the patterns of her oppressors, and the subtle power of patience. She was invisible, yet she saw everything. She was quiet, yet her mind was active, plotting, observing, cataloguing. Every day she spent in the Harlan household reinforced a truth she had always known. Survival required more than strength. It required intelligence, observation, and an understanding of human nature that few possessed. As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed the family's predictable behaviors creating opportunities. She realized that their overconfidence, arrogance, and ignorance could be exploited in ways they could never imagine. Every detail she had learned, the father's temper, the mother's vanity, the children's arrogance, the servants' fears, could be woven into a plan that would strike at the very core of their pride. She was not merely surviving, she was preparing, gathering the knowledge and patience necessary to execute something that no one would see coming. The kitchen became her sanctuary, the dining hall her classroom, and the quiet halls of the estate her laboratory. She tested her understanding of the family's behaviors, watching how small gestures could alter moods, how words could shift dynamics, and how patience could turn ignorance into vulnerability. Every detail mattered, every observation could be used, and every interaction was a lesson in human psychology, in strategy, and in subtlety. Even the minor members of the household were part of her calculations. The coachman, the gardener, the stable hands. They all played roles, often unwittingly, in the intricate web of observation she wove. She noted their loyalties, their fears, and their tendencies. She began to understand how information flowed through the household, who spoke too freely, who remained silent, and who could be trusted to observe without reporting. The estate was a living organism, and Sarah was learning its every pulse, every heartbeat, every hidden flaw. Through it all, she remained calm, composed, and entirely controlled. Her exterior revealed nothing of the storm brewing within her mind. To the Harlans, she was the perfect servant, attentive, capable, and obedient. Yet behind every polite nod and quiet smile lay a mind working tirelessly, quietly preparing for a moment that would change everything. The subtle accumulation of knowledge, patience, and observation was building toward a crescendo, a single point in time when the careful calculations of months would converge into a decisive action that no one could anticipate. By the end of her second season in the Harland household, Sarah Williams had mastered the art of invisibility. She moved unseen, learned everything, and began to craft the first outlines of a plan that would strike with precision and inevitability. Every family weakness, every blind spot, every minor flaw in behavior had been catalogued and stored in her mind. And as she stood in the quiet of the night, looking over the estate, she understood a truth few could ever comprehend, that knowledge, patience, and observation could be more powerful than any whip, sword, or fortune. The Harlands believed they ruled their world, yet the world was quietly shifting beneath their feet, and Sarah Williams was at the center of that shift, ready to transform their arrogance into vulnerability. The evening of the dinner arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost unnatural. Outside the Harland estate, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the ornate facade of the mansion. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the distant kitchens and the earthy aroma of the surrounding woods. The family moved through the estate with their usual airs of importance, unaware that this night, like so many before, would be observed with an intensity far beyond anything they could imagine. Sarah Williams, poised and composed, moved through the halls like a shadow, her dark eyes taking in every detail, committing every element to memory, every nuance to her plan. The dinner was not merely a meal, it was a ceremony, an exhibition of wealth, power, and control. The Harlands had spared no expense, and the table was a spectacle of opulence. Silver candlesticks glimmered in the flickering light of countless candles. Polished china and crystal glasses reflected the warm glow, arranged with precision that spoke of Mrs. Harland's obsession with perfection. Platters of roasted meats, vegetables glistening with butter, and delicacies sourced from far-flung regions filled the room with aroma and promise. The family's pride in this display was palpable, each member moving with the confidence of those accustomed to command, to influence, to unquestioned authority. Sarah had spent hours in the kitchen preparing the eel, attending to every detail with meticulous care. To the untrained eye, her movements were simple and routine, stirring, seasoning, plating, adjusting. But each action was deliberate, calculated, a small part of a plan that only she fully understood. She measured spices with precision, ensuring that each dish contained exactly what she intended. Every pot and pan, every slice and simmer contributed to a chain of events that would unfold in the dining hall. While the family believed her to be an obedient, competent servant, she was quietly setting the stage for a night that would change the lives of all present. The family entered the dining room with their usual airs of entitlement. Mr. Harland took his seat at the head of the table, chest straight, eyes scanning the room with the quiet authority of a man who believed the world existed only to serve him. Mrs. Harland adjusted her skirts, glancing over the table with a critical eye, ensuring that everything was precisely in order before taking her seat beside her husband. The children, dressed in their finest, fidgeted impatiently, anticipating the meal and the small game of superiority that inevitably accompanied it. The room was alive with expectation, yet none could sense the tension that Sarah carried quietly beneath the surface, hidden behind her calm demeanor. Sarah moved through the room, serving each dish with exacting care. Her hands were steady, her face composed, her movements deliberate. She knew exactly how a family member preferred their food, how they would react to different textures and flavors, and how their attention to detail, or lack thereof, could be manipulated. As she placed the first plate in front of Mr. Harland, she noted the slight twitch of his brow, the subtle impatience in his posture. She observed Mrs. Harland's critical inspection of the silverware, the children's eager glances at the dishes in front of them. Every reaction, every subtle cue was stored in her mind like a piece of a larger puzzle. The conversation at the table was light, almost frivolous, but Sarah listened with a careful ear. Mr. Harland spoke of his recent ventures, boasting of profits and achievements, his tone dripping with pride. Mrs. Harland corrected minor details, asserting her knowledge and authority, her voice calm but sharp. The children interjected with laughter and teasing remarks, each trying to outshine the others, each displaying their youthful arrogance. To the casual observer, it was a family at ease, confident in their wealth, secure in their power. To Sarah, every word, every pause, every inflection was a thread to be used later, a detail that could be leveraged to maximum effect. As the first course was consumed, subtle changes began to occur, imperceptible to the family, but not to Sarah. She watched how Mr. Harland's hand trembled slightly as he raised his wineglass, how Mrs. Harland's eyes flickered toward a particular dish with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The children's laughter had a nervous edge. These tiny reactions were confirmation that her careful preparations were having the intended effect. She remained composed, her face serene, as if the room's energy held no significance beyond the routine of service. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, her mind was a whirlwind of calculation, observation, and anticipation. The meal progressed with the same outward normalcy, each course arriving at precisely the right moment. Roasted fowl, vegetables glistening with butter, freshly baked bread, and delicate pastries all found their way to the table with perfect timing. Sarah noted every detail, which foods elicited satisfaction, which dishes were consumed more quickly, which elicited complaints or minor corrections. She observed body language with precision, noting how the family leaned forward, how they gestured, how their attention shifted between conversation and consumption. Each observation reinforced her understanding of the family's patterns, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. By the time the main course had been cleared, the tension beneath the surface had grown almost imperceptibly. The Harlands remained unaware, focused on the satisfaction of their appetites, the performance of their social roles, and the comfort of routine. Yet the subtle shifts Sarah had introduced, the slight adjustments to seasoning, the careful timing of service, the minor alterations in preparation, were beginning to take effect. She noted the first signs, a hand lingering too long over a dish, a faint blush rising to a cheek, a slight hesitation in speech. These were not dramatic changes, but to her trained eye, they were the beginnings of a chain reaction that would unfold with devastating precision. The children, in particular, began to display small signs of discomfort. One fidgeted in his chair, pushing at a vegetable he had previously loved. Another glanced nervously at his sister, who seemed unusually subdued. Sarah's observations were keen, and she adjusted her movements accordingly, serving the next course with deliberate calm, ensuring that no suspicion could be aroused. Her demeanor was flawless, her presence barely noticeable, yet every action was carefully orchestrated to guide the evening toward its inevitable conclusion. Mrs. Harland, preoccupied with appearances, failed to notice the subtle changes around her. She fussed over the arrangement of utensils, the alignment of plates, the gleam of the candlesticks, oblivious to the underlying shifts in her family's behavior. Mr. Harland, proud and self-assured, continued to dominate conversation, unaware that the very food he consumed was subtly influencing his body and mind. Sarah's careful preparation had accounted for every preference, every habit, every predictable reaction. She had observed, calculated, and anticipated, leaving nothing to chance. Even the servants played their unwitting roles in this carefully orchestrated evening. They moved through. The kitchen and halls as usual, unaware of the subtle manipulation Sarah had implemented. Their presence, routine and familiar, added a sense of normalcy to the proceedings, masking the quiet tension that underlay the evening. Sarah observed them with mild interest, noting which were diligent, which were distracted, and which might inadvertently affect the unfolding plan. Each observation was a small thread in the tapestry she was weaving, ensuring that every variable was accounted for before the climax of the evening. As dessert arrived, the tension in the room, still invisible to the family, had reached a subtle crescendo. Candles flickered, casting shadows across polished surfaces. The aroma of pastries mingled with the lingering scents of roasted meats. The family conversed politely, yet beneath the surface, small signs of unease began to appear. A cough, a slight pallor, a hesitation before tasting a bite. Each was noted by Sarah, catalogued and integrated into her understanding of the evening's trajectory. She remained calm, poised, her exterior betraying nothing of the storm that simmered just beneath the surface. It was in these final moments before the inevitable that Sarah's skill, patience, and intelligence were most evident. She moved among the family with effortless grace, adjusting plates, refilling glasses, offering assistance with a serene smile. Every gesture was calculated to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to prevent suspicion, and to ensure that the family remained entirely unaware of the quiet transformation occurring in their bodies and minds. To any casual observer, she was merely a competent, attentive servant. To herself, she was the architect of a plan whose consequences would reverberate long after the candles burned low. By the end of the evening, as the final course was consumed, and the family leaned back in their chairs, satisfied and oblivious, Sarah Williams had achieved something remarkable. She had navigated the dinner flawlessly, orchestrating a performance in which she appeared entirely invisible while her subtle manipulations worked their effect. The Harlands, in their arrogance and self-assurance, were unaware that their pride, their habits, and their ignorance had all been accounted for, catalogued, and prepared for the night's impending events. As she cleared the final plates, Sarah paused for a brief moment, allowing herself a silent, almost imperceptible exhale. Her eyes, dark and steady, swept across the family one last time. Every movement, every glance, every reaction had been observed, stored, and understood. She had played her part perfectly, blending into the background while the seeds of chaos had been quietly sown. The room, bathed in candlelight, echoed with the family's laughter and contentment. Yet beneath that veneer of normalcy lay the first ripples of a night that would change everything. Sarah left the dining room, moving silently back toward the kitchen, her mind already calculating the next steps, already anticipating the culmination of her careful work. Every detail had been accounted for, every reaction predicted, every vulnerability catalogued. She understood, more clearly than anyone in the household could ever imagine, that the calm of the dinner was merely the prelude to the storm, the quiet moment before the inevitable chaos. And as she prepared for the next stage of her plan, she knew with certainty that when the night came to its conclusion, no one would ever forget the events that began with a single, unremarkable dinner. The night had deepened over the Harland estate, cloaking the mansion in a shadowed stillness that seemed almost unnatural, a silence pregnant with anticipation. Within the candle-lit dining room, the Harlands lingered at the table, satisfied, yet unaware of the invisible currents moving through the air. The meal had been lavish, the conversation light, the laughter confident. And yet, beneath their pride, beneath the veneer of control, Sarah Williams' subtle manipulations were beginning to work their slow, deliberate effect. The seeds she had planted over weeks of observation, calculation, and quiet patience were finally taking root. At first the changes were imperceptible. A slight pallor on Mr. Harland's face went unnoticed as he reached for his wineglass. A faint tremor in Mrs. Harland's hand was dismissed as fatigue, the children's laughter a bit too strained, their movements slightly uneasy. To anyone but Sarah, those were trivial moments, inconsequential to the course of the evening. To her, they were confirmation. The plan was unfolding precisely as she had foreseen. She moved quietly among them, clearing plates, offering refills, adjusting the silverware with a calm precision that masked the storm she had orchestrated. Each gesture, each step, was carefully choreographed, part of a performance in which she was the unseen director of their fate. By the time the dessert had been cleared, the room began to take on a subtle tension that no one could articulate. Mr. Harland's words grew slightly slurred as he spoke, a touch of dizziness creeping into his posture. Mrs. Harland's careful grooming of the table now appeared more frantic, as if she sensed an irregularity in the atmosphere she could not name. The children, usually full of youthful arrogance, shifted uneasily in their seats, casting nervous glances at one another. Sarah noted every detail with quiet satisfaction. Her plan was not designed for chaos in the moment, but for precision, a slow unveiling that would ensure no suspicion fell upon her until the consequences were absolute. It was the second course after dessert, the final savory dish, that truly marked the turning point. Mr. Harland, usually confident and boisterous, began to push his plate aside slightly, coughing into his hand as he leaned forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried an unfamiliar rasp, a subtle weakening that went unnoticed by his family. Mrs. Harland set herself momentarily to attend to a candle that had flickered, though her movements betrayed a faint unsteadiness, a lack of the usual elegance she so fiercely maintained. The children's fingers hesitated over the final morsels, a subtle distaste in their expressions, a flicker of doubt that Sarah observed with the patience of a predator watching its prey. The reactions grew steadily, imperceptibly yet inexorably. Mr. Harland's hand trembled as he reached for the wine again, knocking the glass slightly against the edge of his plate. Mrs. Harland's carefully arranged silverware was slightly misaligned as she adjusted it repeatedly, her eyes darting towards Sarah with a fleeting uncertainty she quickly dismissed. The children began to fidget more openly, one of them shifting uncomfortably in his chair, the other touching his lips as if tasting something bitter or unusual. Each reaction was noted, catalogued, and carefully ignored by the family, yet Sarah knew that the subtle transformation she had engineered was now accelerating. By the time the final dessert, a rich custard delicately flavored with spices, was served, the room's energy had shifted almost imperceptibly but unmistakably. Mr. Harland's posture slumped slightly, a sheen of sweat forming along his temple. Mrs. Harland's hand shook almost imperceptibly as she cut into the custard, her eyes narrowing as she attempted to maintain her composure. The children glanced at each other with growing unease, whispers passing. Silently in glances and raised eyebrows. The tension, so carefully hidden in plain sight, was now an invisible force pressing upon the room. Sarah's calm exterior betrayed nothing, yet every heartbeat, every breath, every movement in her mind was tuned to the rhythm of the unfolding plan. And then, subtly, the chaos began to surface. Mr. Harland coughed violently, a loud, choking sound that drew the attention of the family. His hand shook as he reached for the nearest napkin, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. Mrs. Harland's shriek was sharp, piercing the candle-lit room as she attempted to steady her husband, panic rising in her voice as her carefully maintained control shattered. The children gasped, confusion and fear replacing their arrogance as they watched their father struggle, his face pale, his breath ragged. The subtle transformations of the evening had become undeniable, and Sarah observed it all with unwavering composure, her mind recording every reaction, every twitch, every faltering step. The room descended into a rapid, almost surreal chaos. Mr. Harland doubled over, clutching his chest, the wineglass tumbling to the floor with a shattering crash that echoed through the high ceilings. Mrs. Harland, still clutching her own trembling hands, stumbled backward, her skirts tangling as she tried to maintain her dignity and command over a situation that had instantly slipped beyond her control. The children cried out in panic, their voices overlapping, confusion and terror replacing the childish arrogance that had dominated their demeanor only minutes before. Each of these reactions was exactly what Sarah had anticipated. She moved among them with calm precision, adjusting a chair here, offering a napkin there, her face serene, almost angelic in its composure, while the family fell apart around her. What unfolded next was a nightmare painted in slow, deliberate strokes. Mr. Harland collapsed fully onto the floor, gasping, his face a mask of sudden vulnerability that none could ignore. Mrs. Harland's shrieks escalated as she attempted to reach him, tripping over the ornate rug as she stumbled into a chair. The children screamed, their voices piercing the air, but even their terror could not counter the effects of Sarah's careful orchestration. Each body reacted in a precise sequence, as if choreographed by invisible hands. Vomiting, convulsions, pallor and gasps unfolded in a rhythm Sarah had long predicted, each movement confirming the meticulous precision of her preparation. Outside the dining room, the other servants heard the commotion and rushed in, but even their presence could not stem the tide. The Harlands' arrogance, their sense of invincibility, had left them unprepared for any intervention. Doors were slammed, chairs overturned, and voices clashed in panic. Yet through it all, Sarah moved silently, a calm observer and orchestrator, ensuring that each reaction progressed as intended. She offered no assistance, made no mistake, revealed no hint of guilt or anticipation. She had become a force unseen, her careful patience and knowledge transforming a single dinner into a devastating crescendo. By the time the chaos reached its peak, the family lay across the room in disarray, each member incapacitated in their own way. Mr. Harland's body was slumped against the table, his hands clutching at the polished wood as if seeking purchase on a world that had suddenly betrayed him. Mrs. Harland's carefully styled hair was disheveled, her skirt stained and rumpled, eyes wide with disbelief at the rapid unraveling of control. The children huddled together, shivering, terrified, helpless, their cries echoing off the high ceilings. The room was a tableau of shock, horror, and despair, the grand mansion's opulence reduced to a backdrop for the consequences of one servant's intelligence and patience. Sarah remained the calm center in the eye of this storm. Her hands were clean, her posture perfect, her expression serene. To any observer, she was a servant performing her duties, unaffected by the chaos around her. But in truth, she was the author of the night's events, the mind behind the orchestrated downfall of a family who had never once considered that their power and pride were not absolute. Every detail of the evening had unfolded exactly as she had anticipated. Every reaction, every collapse, every cry of terror was part of the pattern she had predicted and prepared for over months of observation. Even as panic consumed the household, Sarah's mind remained clear, calculating, observing. She noted the precise order of each reaction, the sequence in which the family succumbed to the effects of the carefully prepared meal. She catalogued the tremors in their hands, the faltering of their voices, the shifting of their bodies across the table and floor. Every detail was evidence of the success of her plan, a testament to her patience, intelligence, and unflinching observation. She understood, with a clarity that few could imagine, that this night would forever alter the course of the Harland family's legacy, a single dinner transforming arrogance into helplessness, pride into despair. As the night wore on, the effects of the meal spread further. The children, unable to comprehend the scale of the unfolding disaster, began to whimper softly, their bodies weakening as panic overtook them. Mrs. Harland, frantic and terrified, attempted to administer aid, but her hands shook uncontrollably, her face pale, her movements clumsy and ineffective. Mr. Harland's groans filled the room, a sound of helplessness that had never before been associated with the imposing patriarch. Outside the dining room, the remaining servants hesitated, unsure of how to intervene, paralyzed by fear and the sudden, inexplicable collapse of their masters. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah moved with quiet precision, ensuring that each element unfolded as intended. She adjusted a fallen chair, offered a nap, kin to a trembling child, but revealed nothing of her role in the events. Her calm presence contrasted sharply with the turmoil around her, a beacon of controlled intelligence in a world turned upside down. She had executed her plan flawlessly, the months of preparation culminating in a single devastating evening. The family's sense of invincibility, their arrogance and their cruelty had all been turned against them in a manner that was precise, inevitable, and unrelenting. By the early hours of the morning, the room had settled into a grim silence. The grandeur of the Harland estate remained, but the pride and arrogance that had once defined it were gone. Mr. Harland lay motionless against the table, Mrs. Harland's skirts stained and rumpled, the children huddled in corners, trembling, their youthful arrogance shattered. The candlelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the edges of the mansion itself. And in the midst of it all, Sarah Williams stood quietly, observing, cataloguing, and understanding the full scope of her actions. No one spoke of her involvement. No one suspected the careful orchestration that had brought the family to this point. To the outside world, it would be a tragedy without explanation, a disaster born of chance or misfortune. But Sarah knew the truth. Every detail, every reaction, every tremor had been calculated, every step of the evening planned with patience and precision. She had orchestrated a dinner that had altered the course of a family's legacy, transforming arrogance into helplessness, pride into despair, and power into chaos. And as the first light of dawn began to creep across the estate, illuminating the grand halls and ornate furnishings, Sarah Williams quietly moved through the room, her dark eyes steady, her expression serene. The night had belonged to her in every sense. She had waited, observed, and executed with the calm precision of a mind that understood the true nature of power. The Harlands' downfall was complete, not through brute force, but through intelligence, patience, and the careful application of knowledge. The world outside remained unaware of what had transpired within those walls, but for Sarah Williams, the night was a testament to the quiet strength of observation, the power of calculation, and the inevitability of consequence. The dinner, which had begun as a simple gathering of family and indulgence, had become a tableau of chaos and despair, a single night in which arrogance had been undone, cruelty confronted, and intelligence triumphant. Sarah's plan had succeeded in every respect, her patience rewarded, her careful observation validated. And as she left the room, moving silently into the early morning light, she understood that this was only the beginning. The Harlands would never forget the events of this night, and neither would anyone who learned of them. Sarah Williams, the quiet, observant servant, had turned a simple dinner into a force that would resonate far beyond the walls of the estate, a night in which one mind had conquered the arrogance of an entire family. The morning after the dinner arrived like a quiet, almost hesitant visitor. Sunlight seeped slowly through the tall windows of the Harland estate, falling on the rooms that only hours earlier had been filled with terror, chaos, and the aftermath of a plan, executed with precision. The house, so grand and imposing in its opulence, now seemed hollow, a shell of pride and arrogance that had been stripped bare. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft creaking of floorboards and the distant call of birds outside, as if nature itself paused in recognition of the events that had unfolded. For Sarah Williams, the dawn was not a moment of relief, but a time for observation, reflection, and preparation for the consequences that were inevitably to follow. As the family remained incapacitated, their bodies weak and trembling, the household descended into a state of uncertain panic. The remaining servants moved cautiously, whispers passing among them like a current of fear. Who would take control in this new, fragile state? Who could guide the family, ensure that order returned, or attempt to explain the inexplicable? No one spoke directly of Sarah, for her calm composure and careful obedience had long masked the depths of her intelligence. Yet, in the corners of their minds, some servants noticed that she had moved differently during the night, acting as though she were merely carrying out her duties while unseen forces unfolded around her. Her eyes, steady and unflinching, watched without judgment, cataloguing every detail, every reaction, every consequence of her orchestrated evening. The estate's daily rhythm had been violently disrupted. Tasks that were once mundane and routine now carried a weight of uncertainty. Dishes lay unwashed in the kitchen, silverware tarnished from neglect, and the halls, usually polished and gleaming, bore the faint evidence of hurried, chaotic movement. The Harlands' pride, which had previously demanded perfection, was replaced by weakness and vulnerability. Mr. Harland, once a man whose word carried absolute authority, struggled simply to rise from his chair, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mrs. Harland, her hands trembling and skin pale, attempted to maintain composure, but our movements betrayed the chaos she could not contain. The children, frightened and bewildered, clung to each other, their arrogance replaced by fear, their youthful confidence shattered. Outside the immediate walls of the estate, the first signs of the world's curiosity began to stir. Neighbors, long accustomed to the Harlands' wealth, power, and perceived invincibility, noticed the unusual stillness. Carriages slowed as families passed the estate gates, servants whispered hurriedly in town markets, and rumors began to swirl. Whispers of illness, faint murmurs of tragedy, speculation over the cause. All these currents reached the estate like ripples in a pond, brushing against the walls of the mansion with questions no one could yet answer. Sarah, ever observant, watched these ripples as carefully as she had observed the family. Each reaction, each whisper was a piece of information, a confirmation that the evening's events were reaching beyond the walls of the dining room, extending into the world that had long revered and feared the Harlands. Yet for all the chaos, no suspicion fell upon her. Sarah had maintained her composure, her obedience, her quiet efficiency in the face of calamity. She moved through the house with the same serene precision as always, adjusting a chair, straightening a rug, attending to a trembling child, all without revealing a hint of the orchestration behind the night's events. Her mind catalogued each reaction, analyzed each moment, and anticipated the consequences yet to unfold. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had long mastered observation, that timing was as important as action, that patience was as powerful as force. She allowed the world to react, to stumble, to question, while she remained the calm center, the unseen hand that had directed every detail to perfection. In the days that followed, the estate became a theater of suspicion and whispered accusations. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether the events of that night had been natural misfortune or something far more calculated. Rumors grew, fueled by fear and a desire to understand the unexplainable. Yet none dared to confront Sarah directly. Her intelligence, quiet demeanor, and steadfast obedience had long set her apart. She had become a figure both respected and feared in subtle ways, a presence whose calm command of details suggested knowledge beyond the obvious. To those who observed her, she was nothing more than the perfect servant, yet to Sarah herself, she was the keeper of the truth, the executor of a plan that had already altered the trajectory of an entire family. The Harlands, meanwhile, struggled to regain any semblance of control. Mr. Harland's pride had been irrevocably wounded, replaced by a fragile and frightened caution. Mrs. Harland's obsession with appearances remained, but it was now tinged with fear, her carefully maintained perfection overshadowed by the uncertainty that had taken hold. The children, once full of arrogance, were subdued, hesitant, and fearful, their confidence eroded by the realization that their family's power was not absolute. Every moment, every glance, every hesitation reinforced the subtle but complete transformation Sarah had orchestrated. The household's hierarchy, once rigid and unquestionable, was now fractured, the sense of invincibility replaced by vulnerability and uncertainty. As word of the event spread, the outside world began to take notice in more direct ways. Neighbors sent inquiries, some under the guise of concern, others masked with curiosity and subtle judgment. Local authorities, informed by servants' whispers and rumors of sudden illness, arrived to investigate, their presence imposing yet unable to immediately discern the cause of the household's turmoil. Sarah observed all of this with the same calm, calculating eye she had brought to the planning of the dinner. She anticipated questions, controlled her demeanor, and maintained a facade of obedience that disarmed even the most cautious investigator. Her intelligence, patience, and composure continued to shield her, allowing her to remain invisible while her plan's consequences played out with precise inevitability. The narrative of the Harland household began to shift rapidly in the days that followed. What had once been a family revered and feared became a cautionary tale whispered in markets, discussed in town squares, and recounted quietly by servants elsewhere. The story was distorted, exaggerated, and mythologized, as all stories tend to be when fear and mystery intermingle. Yet the truth, hidden behind Sarah Williams' quiet observance, was far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more chilling than the rumors suggested. One dinner, meticulously prepared, had undone a lifetime of arrogance, cruelty, and perceived invincibility. The power that the Harlands had wielded so confidently was revealed to be fragile, dependent on appearances, and easily dismantled by intelligence and patience. Sarah's own role, of course, remained concealed. She continued her duties with the same unwavering attention, moving through the mansion as if nothing had changed. Yet the subtle shifts in behavior around her, the wary glances of servants, the tremors in the remaining family members, the hushed whispers in corridors, confirmed the profound impact of her actions. She did not gloat, nor did she boast. Her satisfaction was private, internal, a confirmation of her patience, intelligence, and meticulous observation. She had acted without detection, executed a plan with absolute precision, and ensured that the consequences were complete and irreversible. The estate itself seemed to respond to the transformation of its inhabitants. Rooms that once echoed with laughter and command now carried a quiet uncertainty. The polished floors reflected not only light, but also the vulnerability that had seeped into the household. The furniture, ornate and imposing, bore silence. Witness to the collapse of authority that had once been absolute. Even the servants, careful and obedient in their movements, seemed to sense a subtle shift in the energy of the home. Every corner, every hallway, every room became a testament to the events that had unfolded, a reminder that power, arrogance, and cruelty could be undone in a single, calculated evening. Sarah Williams, in the midst of it all, remained the quiet eye of this storm. She understood the broader implications of her actions, recognizing that her intelligence and patience had altered not just the immediate family, but the perception of power and control in the community. The story of the Harlands would become legend, whispered with fear and fascination. Some would claim it was misfortune, others would speculate about divine retribution, yet none would recognize the meticulous, deliberate orchestration that lay behind the tragedy. Sarah had ensured that the truth remained hidden, her own presence seemingly ordinary while her impact was extraordinary. As weeks passed, the family's fortunes continued to decline. Mr. Harland's health faltered under the stress and shock of the evening's events. Mrs. Harland's attempts to maintain order became increasingly frantic, her obsession with perfection now tinged with a desperate fear she could not shake. The children, scarred by the trauma, became timid and subdued, their once bold personalities replaced by hesitation and caution. The household, previously a bowl of unassailable power, had become fragile, fractured, and forever altered, and through it all, Sarah Williams continued her duties with unwavering composure, observing, understanding, and cataloguing, the architect of a change that few could comprehend. Her legacy, though invisible to most, was profound. She had demonstrated through patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning that the quietest and most unassuming could wield a power far greater than wealth, brute strength, or inherited authority. One dinner had undone the arrogance of an entire family, exposing the fragility of pride and the consequences of cruelty. Sarah had acted with precision, timing, and an unyielding calm, proving that knowledge and observation were weapons capable of shaping destiny itself. And as she moved through the estate one final time that season, Sarah understood the permanence of her actions. The Harlands would never recover their former dominance. Their arrogance had been shattered, their cruelty rendered impotent, and their legacy forever tinged with the memory of a single evening that had transformed their lives. The community would whisper about the events for years to come, speculating, exaggerating, and mythologizing, yet none would fully grasp the quiet brilliance of the woman who had orchestrated it all. Sarah Williams, once merely a servant in a world that underestimated her, had ensured that her intelligence, patience, and careful observation left an indelible mark on history. She had turned the tools of service, meals, patience, attention to detail, into instruments of profound consequence. The Harlands' downfall was complete, not through brute force, but through the subtle, inexorable power of a mind attuned to observation, strategy, and timing. And in the quiet of the estate, as life resumed its tentative rhythm, Sarah moved among the shadows, calm, collected, and triumphant in the most invisible yet devastating way possible. The story of that night, of that dinner, and of the meticulous orchestration of one woman's mind would live on as a cautionary tale for generations. It was a story not of vengeance born of anger, but of patience, calculation, and intelligence. It was a reminder that power is fragile, arrogance can be undone, and the quietest among us may hold the greatest strength. Sarah Williams had changed history not with weapons, not with wealth, but with the quiet, devastating precision of her mind, leaving behind a legacy as profound as it was invisible.